All right, super. There we go. Thank you. Weird. Okay, now we're cooking with gas again here. Just give me a second to pull this back up. And there we go. Okay, so again, talked Fed 10. Fed 10 has all to do with factions. Madison says that factions cannot be destroyed. So how do you limit factions? You manage them by having a large republic. Okay, great. Next Fed paper that you have to know is Fed 51. Again, you think Fed 51, you think Bob Ross and the pretty little trees. Trees have branches, separate branches. You divide out government powers. Okay, that's the idea of separation of powers. I will tell you that one of the hardest concepts for people in general to grasp is the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. Again, separation of powers is the idea of simply dividing out governmental powers across three different branches. Okay. Checks and balances is a complementing idea, but checks and balances more or less is the idea that a given branch has powers that limit the powers of another branch. So case in point, the biggest relationship I would say to understand is between the legislative and executive branches, more or less because those two branches are heavily reliant on each other to do their jobs, right? Congress, 99 times out of 100 needs the president to sign a bill to make it a law. Okay. So keep that in mind. And so that's probably the most complex of our relationships. Again, judicial branch intentionally does not have a ton of constitutional powers. We can come back to that here in just a minute. But again, separation of powers, we're dividing out the powers across three branches. Checks and balances, the idea that we're going to have powers that each branch will possess that will limit the powers of another branch. Case in point, you talk about like, okay, Congress can make laws, okay, with the president's signature. If the president does not like a proposed law, he can veto it. Okay, he can veto it via traditional veto, via pocket veto. However, again, just because a bill gets vetoed does not mean that it's necessarily dead in the water, but kind of sort of it does, because what is the check that Congress possesses that limits the president's veto power?
They can override the veto with a 2/3 majority in both houses, right?
Yeah, they can. They can. And again, that's politics, not easy to come by, right? I would say in the current political landscape of the United States, that's nearly impossible. We would have again, we talk about like approval ratings and things like that. That's more of like a unit 4, unit 5 matter. But, if a president vetoed a bill and then Congress overrode it, that either tells us one of two things: that we have a president that is totally somewhat incompetent, or we have a very divided government, which, to a degree, political parties are just super polarized nowadays. There's not a ton of leeway in the middle anymore. And so I don't know. It does not happen very often. So understand that. When it comes to checks and balances, what is the most important power that the judicial branch has? Again, we said judicial branch cannot make laws. They cannot pass laws. All the judicial branch can do is interpret laws. So when it comes to checks and balances, what is perhaps the most important check that the judicial branch has?
Judicial review.
That's it. Yep. They can rule on the constitutionality of laws. And again, that's not something that comes from the Constitution directly. That's a power that's evolved over the course of time. It gets written about in Fed 78 by Hamilton, but it's not something that constitutionally the Supreme Court or our court system has always had. That's something that comes about as a result of Marbury versus Madison, where it kind of just gets established that, hey, the court needs to have this power to actually have like any quote unquote government power whatsoever. Again, judicial branch does not have a power of a purse, nor a power of the sword. And so their most important check is judicial review. Congress passes a law. They don't like it, they can rule unconstitutional. President passes an executive order, like forgiving, whatever it is, millions or billions of dollars of student loans. They can rule it unconstitutional. Again, so that's the most important check to understand on behalf of judicial branch. Again, the relationship between executive branch president and legislative branch Congress is much more, it's much more complex. I don't want to say there's unlimited checks because that's not true, but there's a much more complex relationship between executive and legislative branches than there is between any other branches of government. That's just the fact of the matter. Okay. But again, if you understand that 51 deals with checks and balances, separation of powers, Madison being a supporter of those things to ensure that we do not have a one all-powerful branch, that is something that is important to understand. Okay. Questions on Fed 51? All right, not hearing any questions. We'll roll on. Fed 70. Again, Fed 70 has all to do with the president. Easiest way to remember this is our most recent presidents. Our two presidents have been, in their 70s, I guess you could say. And so there's a few things that come out of Fed 70. Again, this is a Hamilton essay. Hamilton makes the argument that having a single executive is the best method, of having an executive branch. The argument that he makes is that historically nations prior to the United States who had multiple executives, what was the issue they faced?
They got power hungry.
Yeah, there was power hunger, right? You'd look at, ancient Rome, for example, like the triumvirates or triumvirates, with the Caesars and the Marcus Aureliuses and, Mark Anthony's and whoever. Like there was almost like a battle of who should have the most power as far as multiple executives. The other thing with multiple executives is oftentimes those governments then also required that those executives would all agree before making a decision, which kind of makes it slower. And so in Fed 70, Hamilton more or less says, hey, we have a single executive. That person is not a king or a queen, even though I would argue Hamilton would have been in favor of that. But based on the Constitution, that person would not technically be a king or queen. But that by having a single executive, that would allow a person to act quickly and concisely, that they would not have to wait on the other one or two or whatever other executives to make a decision, and that they could just make a decision, which, I would still argue that our single president with the current political landscape, that's not always an easy thing either. But that's the argument that Hamilton makes in Fed 70. Again, it's a concern of Brutus, that this person is going to be a king or a queen. How are they supposed to make decisions? Yada, yada, yada. Hamilton basically, responds to those concerns by saying, hey, this is what it is. In Fed 70, Hamilton outlines that the most important trait of a effective executive is energy. Energy and enthusiasm, right? That's why I scream at you guys in the hallways pretty much every day. Energy and enthusiasm, get after it. Okay. Make decisions, be enthusiastic, try to make your best decisions based on the information that you have. And so in Fed 70, he says that is the most important characteristic of an executive. It's not their knowledge of how the government works. It's not their military experience. It's not their success in the business realm or whatever. It is energy. Okay. Just getting things done. In Fed 70 as well, Hamilton makes the argument that executive powers are important, allowing the president to sometimes make unilateral decisions. Again, you look at your constitutions, there is nothing in Article 2, Micah, right? You and I talked about Article 2 because there was the judge that did not know about Articles 2 or 4, which, by the way, Article 2, all about the executive branch. Article 4, all about federalism, dealing with the relationship between the states and the national government. Does that mean I should be a judge? Probably not. But anyways, moving on. So Fed 70, Hamilton's in favor of the idea of the executive having some sort of unilateral power. Again, over the course of history, we've seen that evolve into executive orders. Again, an executive order is kind of like a law, but an executive order, who does it not go through?
Congress.
Does not go through Congress. So whenever the president passes an executive order or issue, I shouldn't say passes. Whenever the president issues an executive order, do you think Congress is real excited about it? 100% no, because usually it's Congress would feel like, well, that person, that president power grabbed, right? You look at over the course of time, FDR used it a lot with the New Deal. Lincoln used it a lot during the Civil War. It's evolved, right? I mean, it's not all that uncommon that executive orders get issued anymore, right? If the president wants to do something that they feel really strongly about, they issue an executive order. Kind of like, the example that I'll use is President Biden and student loan forgiveness, right? Congress feels like that should have went through them. President says, well, based on my legal advice, I can do this as president. And now it's become a Supreme Court issue and they're going to rule on it at some point this summer. Okay. So anyways, but Hamilton in Fed 70 is in favor of that because he says the president at some point in time just needs to be able to make a decision unilaterally on his own, and that executive orders are not the worst thing in the world. Again, executive orders, though, at the same time, that's an example of 200,000 plus Japanese Americans being interned during World War II, right? Executive Order 9066. I believe it was the Roosevelt administration that did that. Well, not super popular. Okay, any questions on Fed 70? All right, Fed 78 then. Again, judges serve a lifelong term. They're older than presidents. Fed 78 has all to do with judges. Another Hamilton essay. In Fed 78, he makes arguments for why judges should have lifetime terms. And that is more or less to insulate them from politics, right? Members of Congress serve either a 2 or a 6-year term. President serves a 4-year term. Judges, he argues, should serve for life because they're not making law. They're simply interpreting the Constitution on what they believe it means. Again, Constitution, I hope you guys have read those things about 100 times, Taco, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure I do. Taco, I still have your pocket Constitution in the top of my desk drawers because you were too scared that people are going to steal it from you. So you should come get this from me at some point, Taco. But nonetheless, Fed 78, the reason for the life terms is to insulate the judicial branch from politics. Okay, that if the judges were to make an unpopular ruling, that they're not going to get voted out of office based on how they interpret the Constitution. Okay. Again, federal judges, they are not elected by the people. They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Congress. There is nothing in the Constitution about there's no formal qualifications to be a judge. Now, does that mean that a president's going to appoint a Domino's pizza delivery person off the streets to be a judge? Does not mean that at all. Again, our judges, you look at any of our federal judges, any of our state judges for that matter, they all have a legal background. They're lawyers, right? They've been judges in other courts. All right. So it's not as simple as that, right? Because there's a vetting process. Again, these judges still have to be confirmed by Congress. Congress still gets to interview them. They are not going, Congress, I would like to think, is not going to confirm the appointment of a judge that they deem to be incompetent, right? Even though I would say a federal judge should probably know what Article 2 and Article 4 in the Constitution say, because I'm just a socialist teacher and I know what those things say. But moving on, okay, neither here nor there. In Fed 78, Hamilton makes the argument that the judicial branch will be the least powerful of the 3 branches because they do not have a power of the purse or a power of the sword. They do not control the budget. They have nothing to say about the budget. They just rule on what the Constitution, what laws mean, okay? They also do not have the power to declare war, right? Congress has the power to do that. President can kind of do that, but they don't have the power to do that. They just interpret, okay? The other thing that Hamilton argues is that the judicial branch cannot even enforce their own decisions. They don't have that enforcement power. They rely on the executive branch or the law enforcement agencies associated with the executive branch. They cannot say, okay, this is the way. Like, the case that I think of is this. I think back to the 1830s with the Indian Removal Act, right? President Andrew Jackson had signed the Indian Removal Act, Native American Removal Act. It was titled the Indian Removal Act. Again, we've advanced politically and socially since then, but Supreme Court makes a decision in a case in Georgia that, oh, by the way, you cannot just force the Cherokee off their land. Well, Jackson chooses not to enforce it. Again, Supreme Court, they can't really do a ton about it. Supreme Court doesn't even have the power to impeach. So again, keep that in mind. Like that, these are, important ideas. And so what Hamilton argues then is that the most important power that the Supreme Court can have is the power of judicial review. Okay. Again, not mentioned in the Constitution. It's not in there. You will not find the term judicial review anywhere in a Constitution. And if you do, it's fake news. Okay. It's not in there. I've read a Constitution 100 times or more in my life. It is not in there. And so it takes until the early 1800s for this power of judicial review to be officially established, thus giving the court the power to rule on the constitutionality of laws. And that's the game changer, is Hamilton says they have to have that power because that is what makes them equal, so to speak, in the grand scheme of things, to the powers of the executive and legislative branches. Okay. Questions on Fed 78. Again, how you remember Fed 78, it's about judges. Presidents are old, judges are older, lifetime terms. Okay. Questions on Fed 78. Okay. Working backwards then, if there's no questions, we talked the Federalist Papers. Obviously, we then have to talk Brutus again. Again, Brutus is an anti-Fed paper. And Brutus is basically every argument under the sun as to why the Constitution is bad, why it's evil, so on and so forth. Okay. And their biggest arguments, and we've been over these, but that the national government will take away rights of the people. Again, the original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. And that was something that was very concerning to the Anti-Federalists, very concerning to Brutus. Other things concerning to Brutus was that it's written in the Constitution, Congress has the ability to tax. Again, taxes, that's the entire reason why America was born, or why the US was born. It was over the issue of taxes, and that he was concerned about that. Okay, that Congress is going to have this ability to tax, and the way it's written in the Constitution, it's not super specific. Okay. Another thing that Brutus is concerned about is the supremacy clause. All laws passed by the federal government and or the Constitution are superior to the states. In other words, if there's ever a conflict between the two, national rule or national law is what gets recognized. Okay. So that's another thing. It's taking power away from the states. And again, Brutus was all about small state governments kind of running the show, very similar to what was under the Articles of Confederation. But Brutus did not like, the Anti-Federalists did not like the strengthening of the national government on the scale that the Constitution would have done. Okay, so that's something else. Another part of the Constitution that Brutus did not like was the necessary and proper clause, elastic clause, whatever you want to call it, allowed the national government to stretch its powers, making like nuclear weapons and getting into education and some other things that we talked about last night. And again, we've already, I think hit the nail on the head that Brutus overall felt like the state and the local government should have more say so than the national government. Okay, that's what people would want based on the unique circumstances of their state. Okay, questions on Brutus. So again, lots to know there. Just working our way then through here. Declaration of Independence. These are ideals of government. Some big themes to understand are consent of the governed, the social contract, and natural rights. Again, the term natural rights gets changed in the Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not life, liberty, and property, because, Jefferson and the boys, well, they didn't think that everybody should own property. Okay. So again, Declaration of Independence is all about themes, all about what a government should do. Consent of the governed, that people give their permission to a government to rule them. Social contract, the idea that people give up certain rights to be governed by a fair government. And again, natural rights, I think we've hit the nail on the head there already. Questions on the Declaration. Again, please, if you take anything out of a government class, understand the Declaration of Independence is not a governing document of the United States. It is, in the sense that it sets forth the themes of what a government should do. It does not create any formal structure of government whatsoever. Like you think like the word democracy or republic. They don't appear in the Declaration. They're not in there. Okay. So keep that in mind as well. I still have family members that believe the Declaration of Independence is the end all be all and how a government, and how government structure is, and it's not. That's the Constitution. Okay. Declaration of Independence, obviously very important for how the Constitution ends up getting written with some of the themes and powers of government, that type of thing. But again, it does not create a structure of government. It's a breakup letter. Okay. It's the same. I would compare it to the same text message I received when I was 17 years old from my high school girlfriend that she wanted to break up with me. Okay. Because of whatever reasons. That's what the Declaration of Independence is. Okay. Questions on that? And for by all means, like, ask, please. Okay, articles, original governing document of the United States. This document actually creates a formal governing body of the United States. Under the articles, the states and the local governments had the most power. The national government had the least amount of power. That was very much done on purpose. Emphasis on state sovereignty, that the United States, the US states almost get to act as independent nations. The way they went about trading with foreign nations and some other things, having their own currencies, kind of highlights that. We did have a president under the Articles of Confederation. People sometimes forget that, but they weren't called the president of the United States. They were called the president of the Congress. Again, Congress was the only body of the national government that existed under the Articles of Confederation. So we had a Congress. They could do very limited things, and it took a super majority of states to really accomplish any of those. I don't think the AP test is going to ask you about John Hanson, but there are some people that would argue he was the first true president of the United States because he was president of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. But again, under the Articles, we did not have an executive branch. There was no national law enforcement mechanism. We did not have a national court system. And most importantly, our national government, the Congress, lacked the power to tax. Again, the United States was in a financial disaster following the American Revolutionary War, and they didn't have the power to raise any money to pay any of their debts back, which indirectly leads to a bunch of land foreclosures. And this angry farmer in Massachusetts, what was his name? Angry farmer, Massachusetts, what was his name? Daniel Shays, eventually leads an uprising against the various governments over land foreclosures because he was upset about that they had not been paid. The national government had no way of paying veterans of the American Revolutionary War, and thus leads to his rebellion, and thus leads to the creation of the Constitution. Okay, questions on the articles. Big things to understand there is if, let's just say this, okay, so current structure of Congress under the Constitution. Every state receives one person in the House, one representative in the House, regardless of population. If you have a higher population, you get more people in the House. Okay, great. Every state, no matter what, gets 2 members of the Senate, whether you're North Dakota or California, whether you have 800,000 people or like nearly 30 million people living in your state, you get 2 senators. Okay. Well, under the Articles of Confederation, states sent between like 3 and 5 representatives to Congress. Between the 3 or 5 representatives, unicameral, by the way, under the Articles, unicameral Congress, 1 House, they got 1 vote as a state. They didn't get to vote individually. Okay. It's not like it was now. It was a state vote. So state of Georgia, how do you vote? Even though you might have 4 different opinions on a matter, they got 1 vote. It wasn't efficient. And to change the articles, if they said, hey, let's create an executive branch, let's have some sort of law, national law enforcement, anything, it would have taken all of the states, all 13 of them. It was not efficient. Again, the idea, though, is you have to understand, though, is why. Why make the national government so weak? Think about what they just came out of. They just fought a war to get out of a very powerful national government in Great Britain. Okay. So again, keep that in mind here. But ultimately, after Shays' rebellion, it leads to the very failed Annapolis Convention. Again, we compare the Annapolis Convention to Mr. Rose's 13th birthday party. Nobody showed up. Now, in real life, people did come to my 13th birthday party. I forget exactly what we did. I think we went to B-dubs, but nonetheless, neither here nor there. Nobody comes to Annapolis. Madison sends out the invitation. 12 of the 13 states show up in the city of burning garbage. I mean, Philadelphia the next summer. And eventually the Constitution gets written. Again, understand with that Philadelphia Convention, the original intent was not to write a new constitution, but rather to fix the Articles of Confederation. But it becomes quickly apparent to everybody that just could not be done. We needed to start over. Okay. Questions on the articles? No.
Yeah, maybe one. Do you think the AP might ask us to compare the articles, like the articles within the Articles of Confederation, to the Constitution?
For sure. I do. For sure I do. And I would be most concerned about the powers of Congress. Okay. That because again, in the Constitution, like the big one that sticks out to me is the power to tax. In the Constitution, you look in Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to tax. That was not a thing with the articles. That statement, you will not find it. You'll actually find, I forget the article in the Articles of Confederation. Okay. I'll self-admittedly, I'll tell you guys, I have not read the articles nearly as many times as I've read the Constitution. But there's actually a statement in the articles that does that, like it bans Congress from taxing. And that's a big one. Again, no executive either. So again, Article 2 of the Constitution might be something you would come back on there. But yeah, perhaps, generally speaking, just from the sample questions I've seen, they're going to ask you, in a broader sense, I would say they're probably not going to ask for like a specific article of the Articles of Confederation, even though if you know that, that'd be super impressive. But in a broader sense. Okay. So I would just have a bigger idea of the differences because you get asked, hey, compare this to that. It might be in the form of a multiple choice. In an FRQ, I don't really see where that would fit, but in a multiple choice question, it might. Okay. It's a good question though. We're going to save the Constitution for next time just because I want to talk through amendments more. And we'll hit letter from Birmingham Jail and we'll call it a night. Again, letter from Birmingham Jail, that's a civil rights document. Okay. You have to know this one. It's very long. It's full of racial expletives, I guess. So it's something that I am you, and there's a very much a reason why we read this one on our own in class. But again, this is written by Martin Luther King Jr. in response to local church clergy members who said that African Americans should just kind of accept the status quo in the South with segregation, right? That they should not be out protesting. Okay. So from the jail cell that he was sitting in Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote this on various, slivers of newspaper, eventually gets pieced together into one bigger document. But basically, he encourages civil disobedience, especially in regards to the injustices that African Americans were facing in the South in the form of racial segregation, in the form of voting discrimination, so on and so forth. And, he brings light to the idea that, hey, Thomas Jefferson, a white man, as a matter of fact, a white slave owner from Virginia, says in this document that he wrote that all men are created equal. Well, why aren't African Americans being, treated equal? He also brings light to the idea that, hey, Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, again, big question here. What does Jefferson say people have the right to do if the government's not being fair?
Abolish it and create a new one.
Yeah, they can fix it. Whether that's through revolt, which Jefferson was all about revolts, right? He later goes to France and helps them with their own revolution there. But that people can fix it. They can change it. Okay. And that they should not have to follow unjust laws. And so there's a quote from that unjust laws, in this case, referring to segregation, that those really cannot technically be laws based on the ideals of the American government. Okay. Again, very much a civil rights article or civil rights essay, document, however you want to call it. Be aware of it. You know, you might see questions on the AP test about it, but again, understand the context of it. Again, it's a longer read. I would encourage all of you to read it again. You can find it very easily online. And if for some reason you can't, I can share a link with you guys. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop the share here just based on time.